You should learn when to stop acting like this is still your house, my daughter-in-law said softly over dinner, and the strangest part was that nobody at the table looked surprised. Ryan kept cutting his steak into careful little pieces without lifting his eyes. Claire lifted her wine glass with that polished smile she used at charity luncheons and church events, the one everyone in Fairfield seemed to admire. Even my granddaughter Sophie suddenly became very interested in her mashed potatoes. The chandelier above us cast a warm golden light across the dining room, but I remember feeling cold all the way down to my hands. I sat there quietly with my napkin folded in my lap, while the smell of rosemary chicken and baked bread filled the room that used to belong to me and my husband. 8 months earlier, I had stood in the same dining room wearing black beside my husband's framed funeral portrait, while neighbors carried casseroles through the front door and whispered condolences that dissolved into silence the second they reached my eyes. I remembered thinking grief would be the hardest thing I would ever survive. I was wrong. Grief was honest. What came after grief was something else entirely. Claire didn't mean anything by it, Ryan finally muttered without looking at me. His voice sounded exhausted, like a man already tired of a conversation that had barely begun. Claire reached over and touched his wrist gently, almost lovingly, but I knew her gestures too well now. They were always perfectly timed, perfectly measured. I'm just saying Evelyn deserves peace, she said smoothly. This house is too much stress for someone your age. Someone your age. I noticed how easily those words rolled off her tongue now. 8 months ago, I was still Mrs. Carter whenever her friends visited. Now I was someone your age. I looked around the dining room slowly. The pale gray walls had been my idea. The antique cabinet beside the fireplace had belonged to my mother. The crystal bowls on the table were gifts from my husband Richard on our 25th anniversary. 39 years earlier, Richard and I had stood in this empty house eating takeout Chinese food from paper cartons while sitting on the hardwood floor because we couldn't afford furniture yet. We built this life piece by piece, weekend by weekend, paycheck by paycheck. Back then, Ryan used to run through these hallways in socks, laughing so loudly the neighbors complained through the walls. Now he sat 10 feet away from me looking like a guest in his own life. I'm not stressed, I said quietly. Claire smiled again. Of course not. But wouldn't it be nice to simplify things? Simplify. That was another one of her favorite words lately. Simplify the guest list. Simplify the upstairs storage. Simplify family responsibilities. Somehow simplify always meant removing pieces of me from the house. A few weeks earlier, I had gone looking for my winter coats and found them packed into cardboard boxes in the garage beside old Christmas decorations. Claire had blinked innocently and said she thought I wasn't using them anymore. The month before that, she had converted Richard's study into a yoga room without asking me first. His books disappeared overnight. His leather chair vanished 2 days later. I let it go. I let all of it go. That was what women like me were taught to do. Keep the peace. Don't embarrass the family. Don't make things harder for your children. I spent nearly 7 decades believing silence was the same thing as dignity. Sophie finally glanced up at me, her blue eyes nervous. She looked so much like Ryan had looked at 11 years old that my chest tightened painfully for a second. Grandma made the pie, she said softly, almost like an apology. Claire gave a quick laugh. And it's delicious. Evelyn always keeps herself busy. Busy. Another small word that somehow managed to sound cruel. I stared down at my untouched plate while their voices blurred together around me. Outside the windows, rain tapped softly against the glass, and somewhere upstairs the grandfather clock Richard restored years ago chimed 8 times. I suddenly realized nobody had asked me a single question during the entire meal. Not about my day. Not about my health. Not about the garden I spent all spring planting alone after Richard died. I was sitting at my own table like distant company people felt obligated to tolerate. Then Claire leaned back in her chair and said the sentence that changed something deep inside me forever. Honestly, Ryan and I have been discussing what's realistic long-term. She said it gently, calmly, the same way someone might discuss replacing old kitchen appliances. Ryan still didn't look at me. And in that moment, something inside me finally became very still. Not broken, not angry, just still. I folded my napkin carefully beside my plate and stood up without a word. Claire blinked, surprised by how quietly I moved. Evelyn? She asked. I smiled politely. I think I'm tired. Ryan finally looked up then, but only for a second. Good night, Mom. Mom. The words sounded automatic now. Empty. I climbed the stairs slowly, one hand brushing the banister. Richard had re-finished himself the summer he turned 53. Upstairs, the hallway smelled faintly like lavender and old cedar wood. My bedroom waited at the end of the hall exactly as I had left it that morning. Richard's reading glasses still rested on the nightstand beside his old navy blue watch. Some nights I still caught myself listening for his footsteps. I opened the bottom drawer of his dresser looking for an old photo album, but instead my fingers brushed against a sealed envelope tucked beneath one of his sweaters. My name was written across the front in Richard's handwriting. Evelyn. Just that. Simple. Steady. Familiar enough to make my throat tighten instantly. I sat down slowly on the edge of the bed while rain continued falling outside the windows. Downstairs, I could faintly hear Claire laughing at something on television. I stared at the envelope in my trembling hands for a very long time before finally sliding one finger beneath the seal. I did not open the letter right away. I sat there on the edge of the bed holding it in both hands while rain slid slowly down the bedroom windows in silver streaks. Downstairs, Claire laughed again at something on television, light and effortless, as if she had not just informed me that my own home no longer belonged to me. Richard used to say that people revealed themselves most clearly when they believed there would be no consequences. I understood those words now in a way I never had before. The envelope felt heavier than paper should have felt. My husband had been gone for 8 months, yet somehow his handwriting still carried more warmth than the entire house downstairs. I finally slid the letter open carefully, trying not to tear the edges. Inside was a single folded page. The paper smelled faintly like cedar and his old cologne, the one he wore every Sunday to church for nearly 30 years. My hands trembled slightly as I unfolded it. Evelyn, it began. If you are reading this, then something has already gone wrong. I stopped breathing for a second. Richard had always known things before I did. That was one of the quiet strengths of our marriage. He noticed tension before arguments started. He noticed loneliness before I admitted I felt it. Even during the last year of his illness, when the medications left him exhausted and pale, he still watched the people around him carefully. Especially Ryan. Especially Claire. I kept reading. I spent too many years convincing myself that keeping peace inside this family mattered more than protecting you. I was wrong. The grandfather clock downstairs chimed once, low and distant through the floorboards. I stared at the words until they blurred. Richard continued, "If they ever make you feel small in your own home, do not protect them the way I did. Love without respect becomes permission." I lowered the paper slowly into my lap. Outside, thunder rolled softly over the Connecticut shoreline. I thought about all the things I had ignored during the past year because I wanted so badly to believe grief was simply making everyone distant. The small humiliations had arrived quietly at first. Claire rearranging the kitchen cabinets and laughing when I could not find my own coffee mugs. Ryan canceling our Sunday breakfasts because Claire had other plans. Family photos disappearing from the hallway one frame at a time until only newer pictures remained. Even my seat at Thanksgiving had changed without explanation. Claire said the lighting near the window worked better for photographs. I let it go. Every single time, I let it go. Because that was what women my age were taught to do. Absorb discomfort. Smooth tension. Become smaller so everyone else could remain comfortable. Richard knew that about me better than anyone. And suddenly I realized something else. He had written this letter before he died because he had already seen what was happening inside this house long before I allowed myself to admit it. I stood up slowly and walked toward the bedroom window. The backyard stretched into darkness beyond the rain, but I could still make out the old maple tree Richard planted when Ryan turned 10. For years we hung Christmas lights on those branches together every December, even after Ryan moved out. Richard always said traditions mattered because they reminded people who loved them before the world taught them selfishness. My chest tightened painfully at the memory of his hands tangled in green extension cords while snow covered his shoulders. I missed him so much some days it physically hurt to breathe. But underneath the grief now, something else had begun settling into place. Clarity, quiet and cold. I folded the letter carefully and placed it back inside the envelope. Then I opened Richard's dresser drawer again and noticed something I had somehow missed before. A second envelope sat beneath a stack of neatly folded sweaters. This one was thicker. My name was not written on the front. Instead, in Richard's firm handwriting, were 5 simple words. For Thomas Green only. Thomas Green had been our attorney for almost 20 years. He handled Richard's business accounts after retirement and helped us establish the trust after Sophie was born. Suddenly, I remembered a conversation from nearly a year earlier while Richard was still alive. We had been sitting on the back porch drinking iced tea while Claire hosted one of her fundraiser brunches inside. Richard had watched through the kitchen window silently for a long time before saying, "Do not ever let anyone convince you kindness means surrender." At the time, I thought he was talking about his illness. Now I knew better. I looked toward the bedroom door as muffled footsteps moved downstairs. Ryan and Claire were getting ready for bed. Their voices drifted faintly through the hallway vents, soft and unconcerned. They believed tonight had been another small victory, another step toward pushing me quietly out of the life Richard and I built together. I sat back down on the bed, holding both envelopes against my chest. Then, for the first time in months, I stopped feeling like an unwanted guest in my own home. Instead, I began to understand something dangerous. Silence was not always surrender. Sometimes silence was simply someone waiting until they finally understood the truth. The next morning, the house smelled like fresh coffee and lemon cleaner, but underneath it lingered the faint, sterile scent of change, the kind that settles into a home after enough memories have been quietly removed. I woke before sunrise after barely sleeping at all. Richard's letter rested folded beside me on the nightstand like something alive. For several minutes, I simply stared at the ceiling while pale gray morning light crept slowly across the bedroom walls. Downstairs, I could already hear Claire moving around the kitchen. Cabinet doors opened and closed in brisk little motions. She always moved through the house like she owned time itself. Efficient, controlled, polished. I dressed carefully that morning in cream slacks and a soft blue sweater Richard once said matched my eyes. Not because anyone downstairs would notice, but because for the first time in months, I suddenly cared whether I recognized myself in the mirror. When I entered the kitchen, Claire stood at the marble island scrolling through her phone while sipping coffee from one of the mugs my sister gave Richard and me on our 30th anniversary. Ryan sat at the counter reading emails on his tablet, already dressed for work in a navy suit that looked too expensive for the tiredness in his face. Sophie ate cereal quietly while swinging her legs beneath the stool. Nobody looked up immediately when I walked in. It struck me then how easy it had become for them not to see me at all. "Good morning," I said calmly. Claire glanced up with automatic brightness. "Morning, Evelyn. We are keeping breakfast light today because I have the fundraiser committee. Here at noon." Committee. Another word that had slowly pushed me out of my own home. Over the past year, strangers carrying catered pastries and expensive handbags had begun filling the rooms Richard and I once used for family holidays. Claire loved hosting charity boards, networking brunches, silent auctions. Women with perfect highlights and sharp little smiles gathered around my dining table, discussing donation tiers while treating me like part of the furniture. "I will stay upstairs," I replied softly. Claire smiled without warmth. "That is probably easier." Easier for whom? I wondered. Ryan still had not looked at me. I watched him stirring artificial sweetener into his coffee with slow, distracted movements. When he was 7 years old, he used to climb into my lap every Saturday morning and beg me to make blueberry pancakes shaped like dinosaurs. He once cried for 2 hours because he thought a thunderstorm had scared our old golden retriever. I used to know every expression on my son's face before he spoke. Now sitting 3 feet away from him felt like trying to remember a stranger from an old photograph. Sophie suddenly looked up from her cereal bowl. "Grandma, are you still coming to my piano recital Friday?" Before I could answer, Claire spoke first. "We talked about this, Sophie. Your grandmother gets tired in crowded auditoriums." Sophie frowned slightly. "But Grandpa always came." Silence settled over the kitchen for a second too long. Ryan finally looked up then, discomfort flashing quickly across his face before disappearing again. Claire set down her coffee cup carefully. "Things are different now." Different. Everything was different now. Even grief had become something Claire organized into manageable categories. Richard's sweaters donated after 3 months because they took up too much closet space. His study transformed into a yoga room because the dark wood felt depressing. The framed wedding photo from our living room mantel relocated upstairs because Claire preferred a cleaner aesthetic. I had watched my entire marriage slowly disappear room by room, while telling myself compromise was part of family harmony. Then Sophie quietly asked the question nobody else would. Grandma, are you moving away? Ryan froze. Claire reached for her coffee again too quickly. Why would you ask that? Sophie shrugged uneasily. I heard Mom talking on the phone. Claire laughed softly, but the sound felt sharp around the edges. Adults discuss lots of things children misunderstand. I looked directly at Claire for the first time that morning. Her blonde hair was perfectly styled. Diamond earrings caught the kitchen light when she turned her head. Outside this house, people probably described her as elegant, generous, graceful. But I had finally begun noticing something else beneath all that polish. Claire never raised her voice, never lost control. She simply removed people slowly until only her version of life remained. I am not planning to go anywhere, I said quietly. Claire held my gaze for half a second too long before smiling again. Well, life has a way of changing unexpectedly. Ryan stood abruptly then, grabbing his car keys from the counter. I need to get going. He kissed Sophie's forehead automatically before heading toward the garage entrance. Claire followed him a few steps. Lowering her voice into the softer tone she reserved for private conversations she still wanted overheard. Do not forget dinner with the Holloways tonight. The front door closed a moment later, leaving only me, Claire, and Sophie in the kitchen. Claire turned back toward me with a look so polished it almost seemed kind. The committee arrives at noon, she repeated. Maybe you could spend the afternoon resting upstairs. Resting upstairs. Like an aging relative people politely tucked away before guests arrived. I stared at her for a long moment while Richard's letter echoed quietly through my mind. Love without respect becomes permission. For the first time, I saw Claire clearly. Not as a cruel woman. Not even as an evil one. Just someone who had spent years testing how invisible she could make me become. And worse than that, I realized how often I had helped her do it. That afternoon, I stayed upstairs exactly the way Claire wanted, but not for the reason she imagined. I sat beside the bedroom window with Richard's second envelope resting unopened on my lap, while voices drifted through the house below me. Women arrived in expensive heels carrying floral gift bags and catered desserts. I heard bursts of practiced laughter echo through the dining room that once held Ryan's birthday parties and Christmas dinners filled with wrapping paper and cinnamon candles. Now the house sounded like a hotel lobby pretending to be a home. Around 1 o'clock, I walked quietly to the top of the staircase and looked down through the banister rails. Claire stood near the fireplace wearing a cream-colored dress with gold buttons and delicate pearl earrings I recognized immediately because Richard had bought them for me 15 years earlier during a weekend trip to Nantucket. I had not seen those earrings in months. Claire smiled warmly at a group of women gathered around the coffee table while casually touching the pearls at her ears as if they had always belonged to her. This house is perfect for entertaining, one woman said admiringly. Claire tilted her head modestly. It really works for our lifestyle. Our lifestyle. I stood completely still at the top of the stairs while those words settled inside me. Not once did she mention Richard. Not once did she mention the decades spent building this home before she ever walked through the front door. Everything had quietly become hers through repetition alone. I watched another woman glance toward the staircase. Does Ryan's mother still live here? Claire gave a small sympathetic laugh that made my stomach tighten instantly. Temporarily. We are trying to figure out what is best for her moving forward. Best for her. The language sounded so gentle. So compassionate. That was Claire's talent. She wrapped rejection inside concern so neatly that people thanked her while being dismissed. One of the women lowered her voice slightly, though not enough. That must be difficult. Claire sighed softly while arranging cocktail napkins on a silver tray I bought in Vermont 30 years earlier. Aging parents can be complicated. Ryan feels guilty setting boundaries. Boundaries. I stared at the back of her perfectly styled blonde hair while memories began, arranging themselves differently inside my mind. Suddenly, I remembered the Christmas 2 years earlier when Claire insisted hosting dinner at a restaurant would be less pressure for everyone. Or the summer barbecue where she introduced me to one of Ryan's business clients as Ryan's sweet little helper around the house. At the time, I laughed politely because Ryan looked embarrassed and I did not want to create tension. Now I understood something painful. Claire had been testing how much disrespect I would quietly absorb for years. And every time I stayed silent, she learned she could go further. I stepped back from the staircase before anyone noticed me and returned slowly to my bedroom. My reflection in the hallway mirror startled me briefly. I looked older than I remembered. Not weak exactly. Just faded. like someone who had spent too many years apologizing for taking up space. I closed the bedroom door behind me and finally opened the second envelope Richard left hidden in his dresser drawer. Inside sat several documents clipped together carefully beside a handwritten note. My pulse quickened slightly when I saw Thomas Green's name printed across the top page. Beneath it were trust account summaries, property records, and signatures I recognized instantly as Richard's. I sat down slowly on the bed while sunlight filtered weakly through the curtains. Richard's handwriting covered the small note attached to the front. Evelyn, if things have reached the point where you needed to open this envelope, then I need you to remember something clearly. None of this was ever built without you. Tears filled my eyes before I could stop them. Richard continued, I know you. You will try to make excuses for people you love, even while they are slowly erasing you. Do not. My hands trembled slightly as I kept reading. The house remains under the Carter family trust. So do several financial accounts Ryan believes were transferred years ago. I left instructions with Thomas because I worried kindness might one day become the very thing used against you. Downstairs, laughter erupted loudly again beneath my feet. Someone complimented Claire's decorating choices. Another voice called her remarkably graceful under pressure. I almost laughed then because the pressure Claire described to strangers was me. I looked down at the legal documents in my lap and felt something shift permanently inside me. Not rage, not revenge, just awareness. Claire believed I stayed quiet because I was powerless. Ryan believed avoiding conflict made him innocent. Both of them had mistaken my patience for surrender. I folded the papers carefully and slid them back into the envelope. Then I walked toward Richard's closet and rested my hand against one of his old wool coats, still hanging untouched near the back. I closed my eyes and remembered his voice the final winter before he died. You do not disappear just because other people become selfish. At the time I thought he was comforting me about grief. Now I understood he had been warning me about the living. The next morning I drove to Thomas Green's office alone for the first time since Richard's funeral. The sky hung low and gray above Fairfield, and thin November rain streaked across the windshield in soft, uneven lines while the radio played old jazz songs Richard used to hum absent-mindedly while driving. For months after his death, I avoided places connected to our old routines because every familiar street corner felt like stepping into a memory I could no longer survive. But that morning felt different, quietly different. I parked beside the small brick law office near the harbor and sat inside the car for a moment watching people hurry along the sidewalks, carrying umbrellas and paper coffee cups. Nobody looking at me would have guessed I was walking into a meeting that might finally explain the last year of my life. Thomas himself opened the office door before the receptionist could announce me. He looked older than I remembered, his silver hair thinner now, his shoulders slightly stooped beneath a charcoal sweater. But his eyes softened immediately when he saw me. Evelyn, he said gently. I was wondering when you might come. The warmth in his voice nearly undid me. Not because he sounded emotional, but because he sounded sincere. I had almost forgotten what sincerity felt like. His office smelled faintly of leather books and cedarwood polish. Richard always liked Thomas because he never rushed conversations. Even now Thomas waited quietly while I removed my coat and settled into the chair across from his desk. Finally, I placed the envelope Richard left behind carefully in front of him. Thomas stared at it for several seconds before exhaling softly. I hoped you would never need to open this. I folded my hands together in my lap. Richard knew something was wrong. It was not a question. Thomas removed his glasses slowly. Richard noticed changes after Ryan and Claire moved in during his treatments. At first he thought stress explained it. Then he realized the pattern was becoming permanent. My throat tightened painfully. Hearing someone else confirm it made everything feel suddenly heavier and more real. Thomas opened the envelope and reviewed the documents quietly while rain tapped against the office windows. Your husband made several adjustments to the Carter family trust during the final 6 months before his passing, he explained carefully. Not because he stopped loving Ryan, but because he became concerned about influence and control. Influence and control. Such calm legal words for something that had slowly hollowed out my home. Thomas slid one document gently toward me. Evelyn, I need you to understand something very clearly. The house was never transferred to Ryan. I stared at him without speaking. Legally, he continued, the property remains under the trust with you as primary beneficiary and controlling authority. For several seconds, I simply looked at the papers while my heartbeat thudded quietly inside my chest. Claire had spoken about the house for months as if ownership was already settled. Ryan acted like decisions no longer required my involvement. Meanwhile, all along, none of it legally belonged to them at all. Thomas continued, speaking gently. There are additional financial protections Richard established as well. Tuition accounts, investment distributions, maintenance authorizations tied directly to trust oversight. Suddenly, dozens of small moments rearranged themselves in my mind with painful clarity. Claire, insisting certain renovations needed approval signatures. Ryan becoming tense whenever financial discussions arose. The strange way Claire monitored mail arriving at the house. They had been acting like owners while quietly depending on money they did not actually control. Why did Richard not tell me directly? I asked softly. Thomas looked genuinely sad then. Because he knew you would try to protect everyone before protecting yourself. The truth of that settled heavily between us. Richard understood me too well. Even now, sitting inside that office, part of me still wanted excuses for Ryan. Grief, pressure, marriage complications. But another part of me had finally become too tired for excuses. Thomas folded his hands together. There is something else you should know. He opened another folder from his desk drawer and turned several pages toward me. I immediately recognized Claire's handwriting across printed estimates and consultation notes. Assisted living brochures, luxury senior communities, property valuation assessments for my home. My stomach dropped slowly. These discussions began 4 months ago, Thomas said carefully. Claire contacted several advisors asking what would happen if the trust beneficiary relocated permanently. Relocated permanently. Such clean, polite language for removal. I stared down at the brochures showing smiling elderly couples beside manicured gardens and bright dining halls. Claire had already been planning where to place me while drinking coffee from my mugs and hosting charity lunches inside my dining room. Strangely, I did not feel shock anymore. Just exhaustion. The kind that comes when reality finally stops pretending to be something kinder than it is. Thomas studied my face quietly. Richard instructed me to help you if the time ever came where you felt pushed aside inside your own life. I looked down at my wedding ring resting against the edge of the table. 40 years beside one man, and somehow he still protected me after death better than the people sitting at my dinner table every night. Outside the office window, the rain had finally started slowing. Pale sunlight breaking weakly through the clouds over the harbor. Thomas slid the trust documents carefully back into their folder. You have more power than they realize, Evelyn. I sat there silently for a long moment before finally answering in a voice so calm it surprised even me. I do not think I want power. Thomas frowned slightly. Then what do you want? I looked toward the window where sunlight touched the wet sidewalks outside in thin silver reflections. For the first time in nearly a year, the answer came easily. I want to stop disappearing. When I returned home that afternoon, the house was unusually quiet. The kind of silence that feels temporary, like people have stepped away only long enough to continue pretending later. Claire's car was gone from the driveway, and Ryan had not returned from the city yet. For the first time in months, I walked through the front door without feeling like I needed permission to enter. The late afternoon sunlight stretched across the hardwood floors in long pale rectangles, catching tiny specks of dust drifting through the air. Richard used to call this the golden hour because it made ordinary rooms look forgiving. I set my purse down slowly on the entry table and stood there listening to the stillness around me. No television, no committee meetings, no careful little comments disguised as concern. Just the old house breathing quietly beneath years of memory. I wandered into the kitchen and made tea in the blue ceramic kettle Richard bought during a road trip through Vermont almost 20 years earlier. The whistle sounded softer somehow in the empty kitchen. While the water heated, I noticed something strange on the counter beside Claire's planner. A folder, thin, cream-colored, carelessly left behind in the rush of the afternoon. I would have ignored it once before, but something inside me had changed now. I picked it up slowly and saw the logo of one of the assisted living communities Thomas showed me earlier that day, printed neatly across the front. My stomach tightened. I opened the folder carefully. Inside sat printed brochures, handwritten notes, estimated timelines, and financial calculations highlighted in yellow marker. Transition plan for Evelyn Carter. I read the words twice because part of me still wanted to believe I misunderstood. There were notes about available units. transportation options, monthly care estimates, suggested moving periods after the holidays to reduce emotional resistance. Emotional resistance. I stared at that phrase for a long moment while the kettle screamed softly behind me. Claire had reduced my entire existence to a scheduling inconvenience. I turned off the stove mechanically and continued reading. One page listed projected renovation costs for main suite conversion after relocation. Another included estimated property appreciation values once full occupancy transfer occurred. Full occupancy transfer. They were not simply discussing my future. They were already redesigning my absence. My hands shook slightly as I lowered the papers onto the counter. Not because I felt surprised anymore, but because seeing cruelty written so neatly in black ink made it impossible to keep lying to myself about what this had become. Upstairs floorboards creaked suddenly. I looked up instinctively. A second later, Sophie appeared hesitantly at the kitchen entrance wearing oversized socks and her school sweatshirt. Her long brown hair hung loosely around her shoulders, and she looked startled to find me holding the folder. For a second, neither of us spoke. Then Sophie looked down quietly. "Mom forgot that," she whispered. I closed the folder gently. "I know." Sophie lingered near the doorway, twisting her sweatshirt sleeve nervously between her fingers. "Grandma." Her voice sounded very small. "Are they really sending you away?" "Away." Children always say things more honestly than adults do. I leaned against the counter carefully. "What have you heard?" Sophie hesitated before answering. "Mom says this house needs a fresh start, and that you would be happier somewhere quieter." Happier somewhere quieter. I almost smiled at how familiar the language sounded now. Sophie looked miserable. "But you like it here." I swallowed carefully before answering. "I used to think I did." Sophie stepped closer slowly until she stood beside the kitchen island staring at the folder. "I heard Dad arguing with Mom last week," she admitted softly. "He said Grandpa would be furious." My chest tightened instantly. "What did your mother say?" Sophie's eyes filled slightly with uncertainty. "She said Grandpa spoiled you, and that Dad needed to stop feeling guilty all the time." "Spoiled you?" I looked around the kitchen Richard and I built together from scratch, while remembering every overtime shift he worked to afford this house. Every Saturday spent repainting walls himself because hiring contractors cost too much back then. Claire called that spoiled. Sophie glanced toward the front windows anxiously. "Mom gets angry when Dad talks about Grandpa now." I reached out gently and brushed a strand of hair from her face the same way I used to do for Ryan at her age. "None of this is your responsibility, sweetheart." Sophie nodded, but children always understand more than adults realize. She looked toward the folder again. "Are you going to leave?" For a moment, I almost gave the answer everyone expected from me. The peaceful answer. The sacrificing answer. The answer women like me had been trained our whole lives to give. Whatever makes everyone happy. But Richard's voice echoed quietly inside my memory. Love without respect becomes permission. I looked at my granddaughter carefully and realized she was watching me the same way I once watched my own mother. Learning what a woman accepts. Learning how invisible she should allow herself to become in order to keep a family comfortable. Suddenly, the answer mattered more than just me. I closed the folder slowly and placed my hand over Sophie's smaller one resting against the kitchen counter. "No," I said softly. "I do not think I am leaving." Sophie stared at me for a second, surprised by something in my voice I had not heard myself in years. Then very quietly she smiled. 3 days later, Claire hosted another fundraiser dinner. Only this time the house felt different to me. Not warmer, not kinder, just clearer. Like fog finally lifting from a landscape I had been walking through blindly for too long. The dining room glowed beneath candlelight while polished silverware reflected soft golden flashes against the tablecloth. Claire believed. Details created power. Every wine glass aligned perfectly. Every napkin folded identically. Every flower arrangement angled for photographs she would later post online beside captions about gratitude and community. She moved through the room effortlessly greeting guests with that graceful composure people admired so much. Watching her now almost fascinated me. I finally understood that Claire did not need to scream or insult people openly. She controlled rooms by deciding who deserved visibility and who did not. And for nearly a year, I had allowed myself to disappear willingly. "Evelyn, would you mind staying in the sitting room during cocktails?" Claire asked lightly while adjusting candles near the centerpieces. Some of the donors become uncomfortable discussing finances around family situations. Family situations. I looked directly at her while smoothing the sleeve of my dark green sweater. This is still my home, Claire. The sentence landed softly between us, but I watched something flicker briefly in her eyes. Surprise. Not fear exactly. Just surprise that I had finally answered differently. Claire recovered immediately with a small polished smile. Of course. I only meant I did not want you feeling overwhelmed. Overwhelmed. There was always another careful word waiting. Ryan entered the dining room, then loosening his tie after work. He glanced between us, instantly sensing tension the same way he used to as a little boy whenever Richard and I argued quietly in the kitchen after bedtime. But unlike his father, Ryan had spent years learning how to survive discomfort by pretending not to see it. Everything okay? He asked automatically. Claire answered before I could. Just discussing tonight's schedule. Ryan nodded with visible relief. It amazed me how desperately my son wanted peace, even when peace required sacrificing truth. Guests began arriving shortly afterward, carrying wrapped auction donations and bottles of wine. Expensive coats filled the hallway closet, while familiar laughter drifted through the rooms. At one point, I stood near the fireplace, holding a glass of sparkling water, while several women discussed vacation properties in Vermont. None of them addressed me directly, though they smiled politely whenever our eyes met. I had become decorative, present enough to appear included, irrelevant enough to ignore. Then I overheard Claire speaking softly near the kitchen entrance to one of the donors, a woman named Patricia Holloway whose husband owned several investment firms in Manhattan. Ryan worries constantly about his mother, Claire said sympathetically. After losing Richard, she has struggled adapting. We are trying to make long-term decisions compassionately. Compassionately. Patricia glanced toward me with immediate pity. That must be exhausting for both of you. Claire sighed softly while touching Patricia's arm. Family responsibility usually is. Something inside me became very still again. Not wounded anymore. Finished. I set down my untouched glass and walked quietly upstairs without interrupting anyone. From below I could still hear Claire's smooth, effortless laughter filling the rooms Richard and I once painted together on weekends, while old rock music played from the radio. I entered my bedroom and opened the drawer containing the trust documents Thomas had copied for me earlier that week. Beneath them rested another folder I had not shown anyone yet. Bank statements, distribution authorizations, expense reports, numbers that explained more than words ever could. For months, Claire and Ryan had been using Carter Family Trust distributions for household renovations, private school tuition, fundraising expenses, and social events while simultaneously discussing where to relocate me once I became inconvenient enough. They wanted the benefits of my existence without the burden of acknowledging it. I sat on the edge of the bed staring at the papers while voices drifted upward through the vents below. Then slowly, carefully, I picked up the phone beside Richard's old reading lamp and dialed Thomas Green's direct number. He answered immediately. Evelyn. I looked around the bedroom quietly before speaking. I think I am ready now. Silence settled briefly on the other end. Ready for what? I closed my eyes for a moment. To stop funding people who are trying to erase me. Thomas exhaled. Softly, almost sadly. Are you certain? Downstairs, another burst of laughter rose through the floorboards. Claire's voice floated above the others, bright and charming and entirely untouched by guilt. I thought about Sophie asking if they were sending me away. I thought about Richard writing letters before his death because he knew exactly what kind of loneliness waited for me after he was gone. Most of all, I thought about the woman I saw in the hallway mirror days earlier. Faded, apologetic, shrinking quietly inside her own life. Yes, I answered calmly. I am certain. Thomas's voice became professional then. I can suspend discretionary distributions immediately pending trust review authorization. Do it tomorrow morning, I said softly. Before lunch. After I hung up the phone, I remained sitting there for a long time listening to the muffled sounds of celebration downstairs. Plates clinking, glasses touching, Claire performing perfection for people who would never see the truth behind it. But for the first time in nearly a year, I no longer felt trapped inside the performance with her. I stood slowly and walked toward the bedroom mirror near the closet. The woman reflected there still looked tired, still grieving, but no longer invisible. And downstairs, without realizing it yet, Claire's carefully constructed world had already begun quietly shifting beneath her feet. The collapse began quietly the next morning. No screaming, no dramatic confrontation, just small cracks spreading through the polished surface Claire had spent years building. I was sitting in the breakfast room with tea and oatmeal when I heard her sharp footsteps crossing the kitchen faster than usual. Cabinet doors opened, closed, opened again. Her phone rang twice in less than a minute. By the third call, even Ryan looked up from his laptop with concern. "What is going on?" he asked. Claire forced a quick smile that disappeared almost immediately. "Probably a banking delay." She stepped into the hallway to answer another call, but the walls inside old houses are thinner than people realize. "What do you mean the payment did not clear?" she hissed quietly. Silence. Then, "No, that account should absolutely still be active." Ryan frowned slightly from across the kitchen. Sophie glanced nervously between them while slowly stirring cinnamon into her oatmeal. I sat quietly near the windows watching pale morning light stretch across the backyard maple tree Richard planted decades earlier. For the first time in months, the house no longer felt like it belonged entirely to Claire's version of reality. It felt uncertain, human again. Claire returned a few minutes later carrying herself too carefully. "There is some confusion with the fundraiser account," she explained lightly while avoiding my eyes. "Nothing serious." Ryan rubbed his forehead tiredly. Again. That single word told me more than he realized. Claire poured coffee into a travel mug with quick, tense movements. "I will handle it." Another phone call interrupted her before she finished speaking. This time I watched something flicker openly across her face. Panic. Very small, very controlled, but unmistakable. She grabbed her purse quickly. "I need to go downtown for a few hours." Ryan stood slowly. "Should I come with you?" No, the answer came too fast. Claire softened her expression immediately afterward. "I mean, there is no reason for both of us to waste the morning over paperwork." Paperwork. There was always paperwork. Explanations. Delays. Technicalities. Ryan nodded uncertainly while Claire hurried toward the front door. Sophie waited until the car disappeared down the driveway before finally whispering. "Mom looks scared." Ryan exhaled heavily and closed his laptop. "Your mother is stressed." That is all. But even he did not sound convinced anymore. Around noon another call arrived, this time while Ryan was in the living room taking a conference meeting. His voice carried sharply through the hallway. "What do you mean suspended?" Silence followed while he listened. Then, "No, there must be some mistake." I remained upstairs in my bedroom, sitting beside Richard's old reading chair, while hearing every word through the partially open door. Ryan's footsteps paced across the hallway afterward, slower than usual now. Less certain. A few minutes later, he knocked gently on my bedroom door for the first time in weeks. "Mom." I looked up from the book resting unopened in my lap. "Yes." Ryan entered carefully, his tie loosened, dark circles beneath his eyes more visible in daylight. Suddenly, he looked less like Claire's polished husband and more like the exhausted little boy who used to crawl into my bed after nightmares. "Did Thomas Green contact you recently?" he asked cautiously. There it was. Not concern, not apology. The first real acknowledgement that I still existed inside the structure supporting their lives. I closed the book quietly. "Yes." Ryan hesitated. Apparently, there was some kind of trust review this morning. Trust review. Such formal language for consequences finally arriving. "I see," I answered calmly. Ryan stared at me for a long moment. "Claire said there must have been confusion with account authorizations after Dad passed." I noticed he still said Dad when speaking about Richard to me. Not father. Not Richard. Somewhere underneath all the avoidance, part of him still remembered being someone's son. "Did she?" I asked softly. Ryan shifted uncomfortably. "Mom, some payments for Sophie's tuition and the foundation event did not go through today." Foundation event. Tuition. Household distributions. The life they built while discussing where to relocate me once I became inconvenient enough. Ryan sat slowly in the chair near the window. "Thomas told accounting all discretionary trust distributions are temporarily suspended pending beneficiary review." Beneficiary. Another careful legal word. But this time I understood something Ryan still did not. He thought the review threatened his lifestyle. He had not yet realized the review was exposing his choices. "Did you know about this?" he asked finally. Outside the window, cold November wind moved through the maple branches in soft, restless waves. I thought about Richard writing letters while dying because he knew exactly how lonely this house would become after he was gone. I thought about Claire describing me as a family burden to strangers while drinking coffee from my cups. Most of all, I thought about Sophie, watching every interaction carefully, learning what women tolerate when they are afraid of losing love. Yes, I answered honestly. Ryan stared at me, stunned by the calmness in my voice more than the words themselves. You suspended the accounts? I folded my hands quietly in my lap. No, Ryan. Your father protected them. I simply stopped pretending not to notice. Downstairs, the front door slammed suddenly. Claire had returned home. Claire entered the house, carrying tension like perfume. Even from upstairs, I could hear it in the sharp rhythm of her heels striking the hardwood floors below. Cabinet doors slammed harder than usual. Her voice rose briefly in the kitchen before dropping again once she realized Sophie might overhear. Ryan remained sitting across from me in the bedroom, both hands clasped tightly together while silence stretched between us. For the first time in many months, my son looked uncertain of which version of reality he belonged to. Mom, he finally said quietly, why would Dad do this? I looked toward the bedroom window where late afternoon sunlight rested softly across the maple branches outside. Your father did not do this to you, Ryan. He frowned slightly. Then why leave everything so complicated? Complicated. The word almost made me smile sadly because complicated was how people described consequences when they finally arrived. Richard spent the last year of his life watching me disappear inside this house, I answered calmly. He realized I was helping it happen. Ryan opened his mouth to respond, but Claire's voice suddenly echoed sharply from downstairs. Ryan. He stood immediately, instinct pulling him toward crisis before thought could catch up. For a moment, he lingered at the doorway, looking back at me like someone trying to recognize a familiar face after years apart. Then he left without another word. I remained upstairs quietly while their argument unfolded below in fragments muffled through walls and floorboards. Claire demanding explanations. Ryan insisting he had no idea the trust remained under my control. Claire accusing Thomas Green of manipulation. Ryan finally asking the question he should have asked months earlier. Why were you researching assisted living facilities for Mom? Silence followed that, long enough for even the old house itself to seem to pause listening. Then Claire's voice returned lower and colder than before. Because somebody needed to make practical decisions. Practical decisions. That phrase again. I sat motionless in Richard's chair while hearing years of marriage shift beneath my son downstairs. Not collapse dramatically, just crack quietly under the weight of truth finally spoken aloud. Sophie knocked softly on my bedroom door about an hour later. She climbed onto the edge of the bed beside me without saying anything at first. Children understand grief better than adults think because they recognize when love inside a room changes shape. Are Mom and Dad getting divorced? She asked finally. I brushed my fingers gently through her hair. I do not know, sweetheart. Sophie leaned against my shoulder carefully. Dad cried. That surprised me more than anything else that day. Ryan had spent years mastering avoidance so completely, I sometimes wondered if he still allowed himself to feel anything deeply at all. Downstairs, the house had gone quiet again by evening. No television, no music, no polished laughter floating through the hallways. Just silence settling into corners where performance used to live. Around 9 o'clock, Ryan knocked once more on my bedroom door. This time he looked exhausted in a way I had never seen before. Older somehow. Human again. He stood awkwardly near the doorway while holding a small cardboard box in both hands. I found these in Claire's closet, he said quietly. He handed me the box slowly. Inside rested dozens of old family photographs Claire had removed from around the house over the past 2 years. Pictures of Richard teaching Ryan to ride a bicycle. Christmas mornings in matching pajamas. Sophie as a baby asleep against my chest. Even my wedding portrait Richard used to keep proudly above the fireplace downstairs. I touched the edges of the photographs gently while emotion tightened painfully in my throat. Claire had not thrown them away. She simply erased them room by room until only her version of the family remained visible. Ryan sat heavily in the chair, beside the window, and stared at the floor. I thought keeping peace meant staying out of things, he admitted quietly. I kept telling myself Claire was just stressed, ambitious, organized. I said nothing. Some realizations arrived too late for comfort. Dad saw it before I did, he whispered. Did he know I would fail you like this? The question hung heavily between us. Outside, rain began falling softly against the windows again, gentle enough to sound almost like memory. I looked at my son carefully then. Not the executive in expensive suits. Not Claire's husband. Just the tired little boy who once cried because he thought thunderstorms frightened the dog. Your father knew people become who they practice being, I answered softly. Ryan covered his face briefly with one hand. For the first time since Richard died, I no longer felt anger toward my son. Only sadness for how easily comfort had taught him silence. We sat quietly together for several minutes before he finally spoke again. Claire moved into the guest room tonight. I nodded once. Ryan looked around the bedroom slowly, taking in Richard's books, old sweaters, framed photographs. I did not realize how much of him disappeared from the house until now. Neither had I. Grief blinds people sometimes. Not because loss is loud, but because erasure usually happens quietly. Ryan stood eventually and walked toward the door before stopping suddenly. Mom. Yes. His eyes looked tired and painfully young at the same time. I am sorry. I believed he meant it. But strangely, I no longer needed the apology the way I once would have. After he left, I remained awake long after midnight, sitting beside the bedroom window while rain slid down the glass in silver lines beneath the porch light. Downstairs, the house rested in unfamiliar silence, stripped finally of performance and pretending. I looked around the room Richard and I once shared and realized something important. People thought my silence all these years meant weakness. They never understood silence can also become a decision. And eventually, so can walking away from the people who mistake your love for permission to erase you.